Welcome back to Excellent English. In this video, we are looking at how to write a history discursive essay. If you find this video helpful, please like and subscribe. Please also comment down below what videos you would like me to create in line with history and grade 12 IEB English. So who is this video for? It's for anyone who is taking history as an elective IEB subject, but it is mostly helpful for grade 10s writing their first discursive essay, or for someone who is struggling with writing a good discursive essay and particularly needs to focus on structure. Before we begin, I would encourage you to listen to your teacher and to consult other sources in terms of writing a discursive essay. Your teacher's instructions should be your first advice that you listen to. What is the IEB actually looking for when they assess the discursive essay? The first thing is your argument. Is there focus and is there engagement? Do you have a clear, sustained line of argument? Do you have direct engagement with the wording of the question? And do you have a defensible and logically supported judgment? You need to remember that you should not be storytelling in your essay. You should not be telling your marker what happened. You also need to show a nuanced understanding of the question and of the era you are dealing with. Then your use of evidence is important. You should have accurate, relevant, factual information, and you should integrate this into your argument instead of listing facts, slapping them down on a piece of paper, and hoping for the best. You need to select relevant evidence that proves a point, and then explain how the evidence you have chosen supports the point you have made. Very often, students walk into a test or an exam where they have to write a discursive essay armed with a bunch of facts that they know and that they have studied and memorized. But they're then presented with a question that has very little to do with the facts that they've studied. And yet, they have not studied any other facts, and so they simply have to use these facts and they try to jam these facts into their essay, and it just ends up not making any sense. It's important that you remember you do not spot learn anything. You need to make sure that you have grappled with and engaged meaningfully with the content that you have been presented with before the moment of studying and before the moment of writing that discursive essay. You also need to show a historical understanding of the period in which you are dealing with in the question. This means that you have an awareness of causation or cause and effect. You understand things like change and continuity in history, and you recognize the significance of people, places, and events. You should also be able to weigh certain factors. In other words, look at the relative importance of certain people, places, and events in relation to each other. Your structure and coherence, which is largely what we are focusing on in this video, is also important. You should have an introduction with brief, and I stress brief, context. And you should have logical organization, which means that you organize your ideas and your argument chronologically. And you should have effective paragraphing, where we look at things like the Peel method and using transition words. So what is a discursive essay? Well, I'll start by saying it is not a story. You are not telling your marker what happened. It is an argument that is supported by evidence which answers a specific historical question, a reasoned evaluation of the question, a structured judgment or argument, this is our paragraphing that we're talking about, and an academic, which means formal, historical piece of persuasive writing. Importantly, there is not one correct answer, but there must be a logically sensible answer that you provide in your essay. Some non-negotiables to consider. You need to use the past tense and write concisely. So you should say something like, the policy resulted in increased resistance, instead of, the policy results in somewhat increased resistance. You should also avoid personal pronouns, especially the phrase I think, and you should instead use something like, it can be argued, or it is evident that. You should also avoid colloquial language, emotional language, cliches, dramatic phrasing, rhetorical questions, and sweeping generalizations. Before we begin looking at the structure, let's consider these three things. The first thing is facts. It is not enough for you to simply know events and slap them on a piece of paper and hope for the best. You must understand causes and consequences. You need to understand why events, people, and places mattered. You need to understand how events relate to each other. And then you need to select the most relevant facts that prove your argument in line with the question that you have been given. Then we look at types of questions. You can be asked to assess, evaluate, or discuss, or you can be asked to assess to what extent, evaluate to what extent, or discuss to what extent. All of these require you to evaluate both sides of a story, to form a judgment and criteria for the judgment, and to present supporting evidence for the argument that you have created. You should also consider alternative interpretations, and this means that you have one paragraph which is a counter argument. You could also be asked to compare and or contrast. And in this, you need to analyze the similarity and or the differences. Then you should plan. This is possibly the most important thing you should do when you write your discursive essay. You need to take 5 to 10 minutes to decide on your stance firstly. Then, based on that stance, you need to plan what each body paragraph is going to include, including the counter arguments. And then you can plan what your conclusion is going to say, not necessarily the exact wording, but you need to have a goal. You need to have an end position in mind and an end stance in mind, and that will then determine what you say in your introduction. Speaking of an introduction, let's look at our structure. So your introduction should show your marker how you intend to answer the question by looking at 4 things. The first thing is indicating your argument very specifically and briefly. It should outline the structure of your essay or what you intend to discuss, and it should indicate the type of material or evidence you'll be using. In other words, what exactly are you going to talk about? And then you need to be specific, particularly with names, date ranges, or places. You need to begin with a bold, attention-grabbing first sentence. This does not mean that it is dramatic or emotional. It needs to show the marker that you know what you are doing and you know what you are talking about. So your very first sentence should take a definite stance. It should answer the question as briefly as possible, but it should be a definite stance. Your second sentence should then elaborate very briefly on the arguments that you indicated in the first, and you should incorporate your counter argument briefly in the introduction. You should not ever begin any kind of analysis or introduce any kind of evidence in the introduction. Let's talk about the body paragraphs. Each body paragraph should use the Peel method, which is point, evidence, explanation, and link. Now, your point is your topic sentence. This is your clear stance that you make. You should have a point in every single body paragraph that outlines what that paragraph specifically is going to talk about, and it should also link back to the question that you have been given. You then provide evidence, which is specific facts, and then you need to provide an explanation, which is an analysis of how your evidence proves the point that you are trying to make in that paragraph. You then have a final linking sentence which points back to the point you have made and the question you have been asked. You should use linking words, which is essential for the flow of your essay. I've provided some examples here. You are welcome to pause the video at this point and make notes of these. Then you should also have a counter argument. This is your final body paragraph before your conclusion, and it is essential. You need to be able to show your marker that you have acknowledged alternative interpretations of the topic or question you have been given, explain why they might appear convincing, and then demonstrate why your point or your stance or your argument is still the most plausible one. You should still use the Peel method for your counter argument. Then when we look at your conclusion is very concise. It should mirror in some way the introduction. It needs to directly answer the question again. It should synthesize the argument that you have created throughout your essay, and it should weigh the relative importance of the different points that you have made, but it does not need a lot of detail. You need to avoid introducing new evidence or new ideas in the conclusion. The structure you should use for your conclusion is this: restate the argument clearly, weigh the factors, and deliver a final judgment. Let's look at an example. For the introduction, we have said this: the initial collapse of Khoi independence between 1652 and the 1670s was primarily the result of colonial expansion rather than internal weakness. Although environmental and social factors contributed to their vulnerability, it was sustained settler encroachment and military coercion that proved decisive. This essay assesses economic disruption, military confrontation, and disease in order to evaluate the role of each factor in the collapse of Khoi independence. Now, what I have done here is, in the very first sentence, I have created a very specific, definite point. I have referred to a specific date range and a specific group of people. I have also come up with a specific, clear stance. I have then, in the purple, briefly acknowledge that there might be a counter argument, but with the red writing, you can see that I have also briefly elaborated on my stance and why my stance is still the most plausible one. I've then gone into exactly what the essay looks at, which then guides my marker in letting them know this is what they can expect to read. If we go into an example body paragraph, remember you need to have more than one body paragraph. I've just shown you one example. I've provided you with a key in the top right-hand corner. And you can see there that we've got our point: colonial expansion fundamentally destabilized Khoi society. Our evidence there is the extension of Dutch settlement beyond the original Cape Refreshment Station resulted in competition over grazing lands. And I've got an explanation which proves that the evidence I have chosen supports my point. I've said, as pastoral mobility was essential to Khoi economic survival, territorial encroachment directly undermined their subsistence base. I then have a link, and I have started with a linking word. Consequently, colonial expansion must be regarded as a central cause for their loss of autonomy. There, instead of saying the word there, I would possibly say Khoi society or the Khoi people. If we look at a counter argument, remember you are briefly acknowledging that there might be a different interpretation, but that your stance is still the most plausible one. I start with a point and I begin with a linking word. Now, importantly, I begin with this linking word because I am going to show my marker that I am now addressing something different. So I start with however. I then say internal divisions did weaken Khoi resistance. Indeed, another linking word. Fragmented clan structures limited unified military response. Nonetheless, now my explanation here goes back to my argument, and it shows that my argument is still the most plausible one. Such divisions were not unusual among pastoral societies and only became fatal when confronted with sustained European expansion. My linking sentence there is, thus, internal fragmentation was contributory rather than decisive. In other words, yes, it was a factor, but it wasn't the main thing. We then move to our conclusion. And we briefly acknowledge that there was a counter argument, but we go straight into restating our point. So we say, while environmental pressures and social fragmentation contributed to Khoi vulnerability, it was sustained colonial expansion that ultimately determined their loss of independence between 1652 and the 1670s. The relative weight of military coercion and territorial dispossession far exceeded that of internal weaknesses. Therefore, the collapse of Khoi autonomy must be attributed primarily to external colonial forces rather than to indigenous failings. I look back at the introduction and I ask myself the question, have I addressed everything in the conclusion that I initially put in the introduction? And is everything in the introduction also in the body of my essay? And the answer to those questions should be a resounding yes. So if we read our introduction again, it says the initial collapse of Khoi independence between 1652 and the 1670s was primarily the result of colonial expansion rather than internal weakness. So I have definitely stated that in my conclusion. I then also in the purple, you can see briefly looked at the counter arguments in my introduction, and I did the same thing in my conclusion. I then looked at the red. It was sustained settler encroachment and military coercion that proved decisive, and this is also addressed in my conclusion. Now, the green is not addressed in my conclusion because this is not necessarily something that I had to restate in my conclusion, although in the conclusion you would be able to say this essay has looked at economic disruption, military confrontation, and disease, though it is not entirely necessary. Let's look at some common mistakes that we should avoid. We should avoid writing a narrative. In other words, don't tell the story. You should avoid ignoring parts of the question. You should avoid failing to identify and define key terms. And you should avoid not weighing your factors correctly. You should also avoid listing facts without any kind of analysis. This is the whole slapping facts on a piece of paper and hoping for the best that I was talking about. You should avoid vague general statements that do not point to any specific stance. You should avoid contradicting your own argument. Now, you might ask the question, well, you said I must have a counter argument, and that is correct. But the counter argument simply acknowledges in one short paragraph that there might be another interpretation of the topic or the question, but within your entire argument, you have not contradicted yourself. In other words, your counter argument cannot be stronger than the argument you have created as a whole. You should not introduce new ideas or evidence in the conclusion. Now, if we're looking at an excellent essay, this is what we should have. An essay that answers the exact wording of the question, sustains an argument throughout, uses precise and relevant evidence, weighs competing explanations carefully and concisely, and this is the most important point, demonstrates knowledge and deep understanding of people, places, events, cause and effect, and the question. It should be clearly structured, focused throughout, and contained a decisive and defensible conclusion. Some final thoughts. A history essay is not about telling the marker what happened. You're not telling a story. It's about explaining why it happened, how important it was, and how the evidence proves it, always in line with the question that was asked. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. Comment down below any other videos you would like me to create regarding history or grade 12 English for IEB.